Today we're going to talk about community engagement, which is one of the 3 areas that we're focusing on for our learning questions. If you want to go to the next slide, please. This is our really summarized combating wildlife trafficking theory of change. So today we're focusing on that strategic approach, which is the one in the middle that you see, how to increase community conservation action and support to combat wildlife poaching and trafficking. So you'll see right in the middle of the screen that community empowered to take action on wildlife crime. So that's really the focus of what we're going to hear from David today. And if you want to go to the next slide. Some of the questions that we have for our learning agenda for wildlife trafficking is what is really best practice for community engagement for wildlife. I'm really looking at community incentive structures and also successful examples of community and government collaboration that result in increased support for wildlife trafficking. Under the measuring impact activity here in the FAB office, Dr. Wilkie took a look at other policing programs and other ways that communities were engaged, and so that is the topic of our conversation today. And after David presents, we'll hear a bit from Mikala about how those principles either hold true or don't hold true in USAID East Africa and Kenya programming. So let me turn it over to Dr. Wilkie now to present his work. Thank you so much for joining us.
Could I have the next slide, please? Good morning. As Megan said, yes, this is a research project under the Measuring Impact program of USAID. And really it was a question about, we all realize that over the last decade or so, there's been a mushrooming in the scale of illegal and illegitimate taking of wildlife. And that the fact that there's the rise in prices for ivory, rhino horn, and tiger parts has for the first time really resulted in the engagement of organized crime, and they're getting into the business, and this has increased militarization of poaching. And that, I think, raised a red flag for USAID, who's been investing in many years in community-based natural resources management and sees the value of working with communities to co-manage natural resources. But they were concerned about what would be the risks and the reasons for communities to engage in anti-poaching, given the sort of changing context of illegal hunting. Can I have the next slide, please? So today I'm not going to talk about legal hunting, or I'm really just going to talk about taking of wildlife that's against the law, that's illegal, or against community norms. And I think this is really important to make that distinction. There are some things that are legal, but communities fear that believe that they shouldn't be done. So in the case of the Chimani in Bolivia, taking certain species of catfish during certain years is legal under Bolivian law, but illegitimate under Chimani social norms. So I think it's really important to realize that communities' behavior is both related to illegal and illegitimate taking of wildlife. Next slide, please. When Anita Jacob and Michael Painter and myself started this project, we tried to figure out how could we frame the context for poaching and trafficking in ways that would help us conduct our research and then analyze and report the results and frame the results in a useful way. And in this two-dimensional slide, we actually figured out there was really 4 key factors. The first was, who owns the land where the wildlife were being poached? Is it the state? Is it communities? Is it private? Is the wildlife value is it not valued? Is it highly valued? Are poachers local, or are they coming from outside? And is the market for the wildlife products, is it local or is it international? So by using those 4 factors, that helped us really frame the context for the research. And as you'll see later when I talk about some of the case studies, it helped us look at different real-world cases through that lens of the 4 factors. Next slide, please. The research is based on some literature reviews, interviews with practitioners, and then, as I said, the case studies. Next slide. The first thing we did was look through an electronic search, fairly rigorous electronic search, using Web of Science and Scopus and Google Scholar. Now, these databases go back to 1864. There's 100,000, a million books, 225,000 journals, and over that whole time, we couldn't find a single peer-reviewed journal or grey literature article that explicitly talked about community engagement in anti-poaching and anti-trafficking. The fact that we didn't find anything was an interesting thing, and it certainly told us that conducting this research was worthwhile because nobody had really been thinking about these issues explicitly. Or if they had been thinking about it, they hadn't been writing about it. Next slide. So not having anything to read about and to analyze explicitly relating to communities and anti-poaching and anti-trafficking, we reached out into completely different literature. The whole idea of community policing. Next slide, please. And community policing is now a very common characteristic of the way that police try to work with communities to reduce crime and detect crime. And it really started after police forces realized that many years of moving cops from walking a beat to being in a car distanced the police from the communities and resulted in a increasing distrust of the police by neighborhoods. And the idea was to return to the old beat cop to increase the legitimacy of the police in the eyes of the public. The whole idea of mutual trust in co-producing public safety came up over and over again in the articles that we read. And communities were really only willing to support the police if they trusted the police, if they felt that there was very little risk of reprisals. In other words, their contributions remained anonymous. And interestingly, people were far more willing to talk to the police, not directly, but through a community organization like a neighborhood watch association. That gave them one degree of separation from directly talking to the police. And the third really most important thing that came out of this study on community policing was if a community is disorganized, if there's no community or social cohesion within the community, if community members don't feel they're part of a neighborhood and that neighborhood is worth protecting, then it's very difficult for them to get over the barriers associated with collective action. It's very difficult for communities to come together and work together. Building on the work that USAID has done in community-based natural resources management, again, we looked at this vast literature to see what it told us about what would be the motivations for communities to engage in anti-poaching and anti-trafficking efforts, and what might be some of the risks. Next. And this will not surprise you at all, I don't think, but it very clearly came through the literature that one of the most important factors for communities to be motivated to work on anti-poaching efforts was whether they had ownership rights and the rights to benefit. Second, they really had to have the capacity to enforce rights. That merely having rights was insufficient if you couldn't secure and enforce your legitimate rights. And again, something that came up over and over again was this issue of community cohesion. Unless the community felt that they could work together and had a reason to work together, CBNRM really didn't work. I love this quote by Chris Weaver. Could you go back again? I love this quote by Chris Weaver when he says that when communities perceive poaching to be stealing from them, they're willing to take serious action to stop the poaching. And a really good thing to remember as we think of why communities might be motivated to engage in anti-poaching efforts. Next. And then we decided to look at some of the illegal bushmeat trade to see if that helped us better understand why people might get involved and communities might get involved in poaching, and why they might participate in illegal activities. Next. And this came through very clearly that if communities did not feel that the laws managing wildlife were legitimate and in their interests, they had very little interest in actually complying with the laws, particularly in places where the state owned the resource. And throughout much of Central and West and Africa, all lands are vested in the state, and yet the state basically doesn't have the resources, it doesn't have the interest to enforce their rights. And so local communities who don't believe the laws are legitimate and have little or no risk of being arrested or punished, and often see the arresting authority being visibly corrupt, they have very little incentive at all to comply with the laws. And worse, there's a strong sense that that unwillingness to comply with what are perceived as not legitimate laws results in scofflaw behavior, basically, and undermines compliance with the rule of law. Next. So to substantiate the work that we did through the literature review, we decided to talk to experts who'd been working in this arena for the last 10 to 20 years. We talked to about 20 different people. And thankfully, the things that they said to us actually reinforced the lessons that and the conclusions that we'd drawn from the literature. Getting ownership is essential so that people can benefit from conserving. It's critical that arresting authority does not let poachers know who informs, so that whole issue of anonymity. And I think the thing that came through over and over again is communities should play an eyes and ears in support of law enforcement. They should be providing actionable intelligence. They should not be carrying arms, and they should not be confronting poachers if they can. Next. So to look and see if the conclusions that we've drawn from the literature and from our discussions with interviewees, we decided to look at a series of 6 case studies based on 3 scenarios that came from that initial diagram with the 4 factors. So the first scenario was really looking at local poachers on community lands taking low-value wildlife for local consumption. Next. Could you do the next slide, please? So the first case is in Peru, just off the main branch of the Amazon River in Tamchiacatoayo Community Reserve. So the interesting factors in this was that outside fishers were coming from Iquitos to come and fish in community waters. But access to the community waters, which was a whole watershed, could really easily be regulated by just patrolling the entry point from the Amazon River to Tamchiacatoayo's community reserve. Regional government was highly supportive of local rights, and the community had strong social cohesion and very much were compliant with their own regulations. So this allowed the community to prevent outsiders from coming onto their lands to illegitimately harvest their fish. The government supported that, and they had enough social cohesion to work together to make that happen. As a result, fish populations rebounded, income from fish with the local community increased, reinforcing the fact that if they could enforce their rights, that this would be an effective way for them to reduce illegal use of their resources or illegitimate use of their resources. Next. Similarly, in Madagascar and Anton Bay, the state, unable to enforce its fisheries laws, decided to devolve authority to fisheries management to local communities. This resulted in the creation of about 20 locally managed marine areas over about 200 kilometers of coastline. And today, these locally managed marine areas are patrolled by over 250 local rangers who are recognized by the government as legitimate law enforcers. and they help ensure that the community can enforce its closure zone areas, its no-take areas, and its gear restrictions. Interestingly, in this case, the communities were very interested in enforcing gear seizures because it was really local elites who were encouraging the use of a very destructive beach seine method. And so the community fishers saw their catches declining and the elites making lots of money. But strong cultural norms made it very difficult for community members to inform on other community members. So in this case, social cohesion inhibited effective law enforcement in some cases. But the community also saw octopus populations and other food fish dramatically increase in quantity, and thus their incomes increased. Again, that sort of virtuous reinforcement of their efforts to enable law enforcement within their locally managed marine areas. Next. This second scenario is probably the case that everyone is familiar with when it comes to poaching and trafficking. It's non-local poachers on community lands taking high-valued wildlife for international markets. And in many cases, this is a highly militarized process involving organized criminal gangs. Next. This is probably the acme of examples for community conservancies. It's conservancies in Namibia, first supported by USAID. I think USAID spent over $50 million to try and help the Namibian conservancies get off the ground. And it's been, to all reports, gloriously successful. The number of conservancies dramatically increased, and the populations of wildlife in other places in Africa where they've been subject to significant poaching, Namibia has largely avoided that. Not completely, but largely. And again, the take-home messages are national laws conferring rights, so strong social cohesion and tangible benefits. Most importantly, in this case, timely and competent support from the national police force. Because communities don't have the rights to arrest, they have the rights to detain, they need someone to come out and actually arrest lawbreakers. Interesting, the police had little interest in supporting communities before they gained formal rights to their land. But once they became landowners in the eyes of the national police force, the police force felt obliged to support them when they needed it. So I think that's a really interesting conclusion as well. Next case study is Northern Rangelands Trust in northern Kenya. Again, this is devolution of management authority to a series of local communities. This case is somewhat different because in this case, the 400 conservancy rangers are trained by the Kenyan police. They're considered army reservists and they're armed. This is very different from the Namibia Conservancy and quite different from most of the advice given by the experts about not arming eco-guards and not having them directly confront poachers. The Conservancy Rangers are not armed, but they provide eyes and ears to the Kenya Wildlife Service. And fantastically, not only has poaching decreased on the conservancies, but communities notice that cattle rustling and banditry along the roads has also declined, which is a sort of ancillary benefit from effective law enforcement. Next. The last scenario is a very common scenario where it's non-local and local poachers on state-managed lands where local communities have no recognized rights over the wildlife. Next. The first example is in Philippines, and this is a USAID project, when the state devolved authority for managing marine protected areas to local government units. But this was not directly devolving to local fishers, but to the government body that was responsible for managing fisheries. And initially people didn't trust the local government units to be managing the MPAs in their interests. That changed fairly slowly, and it only changed, I think, for two reasons. One, the fishermen and police went on joint patrols to manage the marine protected area, and that day-to-day engagement with the police improved trust and collaboration between the fishers and the police. There were Catholic priests who had ecological evangelization meetings during church services to argue for the use of marine protected areas to protect local fish stocks for local fishers, which I thought was really interesting. Over time, the closed areas within MPAs did result in fish stocks rebounding and local landings increased. And this, interestingly, resulted in really strong demand from the fishers to have even more devolution of management authority to the local level. And next, the last is a protected area project around Indonesia called Lauridsen. And historically, local farmers were not compensated for loss of livestock as a result of tiger attacks. That meant that there was really no motivation for the communities to protect tigers. In fact, they often informed poachers where to find tigers, or they killed tigers in retaliation for their lost livestock. WCS established the Wildlife Response Units to help local communities fence in their animals at night, conduct nighttime patrols to ensure that if tigers are in the area, they were kept away from the livestock. And they increased the value of the livestock by helping farmers have access to improved breeds. Over time, that dramatically reduced the number of losses of livestock. Families were compensated for the loss, and it improved trust and collaboration with WCS, which in turn changed communities from being informants to poachers to be providing actual intelligence on poaching to the state Wildlife Crimes Unit. So an amazing shift when you think about the motivations for communities to engage in anti-poaching and anti-trafficking. Next. So three major take-home messages. None of them should be a big surprise. Communities need to have the rights of ownership and they need to benefit directly from conservation. Communities need to have the timely and competent support of an arresting authority, and they need to feel that their contributions to that informant network have to be anonymous, so there's no risk of retaliation or reprisals. And the community needs to have a sense of social cohesion. Community members need to trust one another and be willing to work together towards a common purpose. Next. So again, just to reinforce, everyone pretty much said communities should be eyes and ears of law enforcement, not an armed arresting authority. Next. And they need this responsive and competent police support, which I think is rarely actually discussed very often. And in many places, when the police are actually involved in the poaching, that's a huge impediment to communities effectively being able to assist in anti-poaching. And absent that responsive and competent support by police, communities can be in severe jeopardy from organized crime gangs that are highly militarized. Next. A longer discussion of this can be found in two documents. One is the full report from Measuring Impact, and there's a small 4-page brief that you can both download off the web. Next. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks so much, David. Before we dive into questions, which I just wanted to remind people listening in that you can use the chat box to share any questions that you have. I'm going to turn it over to Mikala Lauridsen from USAID Kenya in East Africa, just to comment upon what she thinks about these findings that you produced here, and that's how they relate to USAID's programming in Kenya and East Africa. So welcome, Mikala.
Thanks. Hopefully everyone can hear me. And thank you, David, for that presentation. There's many things in that presentation that really resonated with me. And I think there's some great case examples. And one thing when I was hearing the presentation that I was thinking of is just how different communities are and how we have to be so aware of differences. And that's not only as far as like a country context, but really also within your own country, and understanding how communities differ when we're also thinking about engaging them in wildlife crime. So we provided some support through IUCN here in Kenya, where they're doing some piloting with 3 different communities, and what they're finding through their methodology is that by developing a theory of change with these communities, although they're all in southern Kenya, they're very much thinking differently on how they can participate and address wildlife crime in their communities. And I think that's really important to note, so that we don't just think of modeling, but that we take best practices in modeling and see how they can be applied within the communities that we're working with. Another area is just around the priorities and needs of communities. So we talk often about tangible benefits reaching communities, and I think in some areas it's been very economic focused. But I think we're learning more and more, and it came out also in David's presentation, that there's other areas that are really important for communities, which are not necessarily directly related to things like, tourism benefits or enterprise benefits. So we are seeing in northern Kenya, peace and security has been critical for communities working with Northern Rangeland Trust. And just bringing benefits to security has improved the situation, not only for the communities themselves, but also for actual biodiversity conservation, because they can see a real bonus with having rangers in the area and having a security system and communication system where they can be reporting on crime or any kind of instability. There's, of course, also human-wildlife conflict is very critical for many communities. And again, it came out in the presentation, and I've seen many good examples in both Tanzania and Kenya, how if you do address human-wildlife conflict, again, you get really strong buy-in from the communities of seeing the value of working with wildlife authorities and also community scouts and community rangers. There was one example from Tanzania that I thought was really, really interesting, how they gained strong support and relationships between communities and community scouts, and that was they had sniffer dogs in the area, which were being used obviously for illicit wildlife crime, and one of the children in the village got lost, and they actually used the sniffer dogs to track, to find that child. And again, that just built very strong relations between the communities and the wildlife authorities, and what David had also mentioned, really building these trusting relations. So there's many different ways that can be addressed, but it's really understanding what are the priorities and needs of those communities that we work with. I did want to also comment on the eyes and ears, because I think you have very different levels of capacity and very different kind of security models, I guess you could say, in places that we're working with communities. So I can bring up the example again of northern Kenya, working with NRT. They have a very strong response system of having rangers on the ground who are community rangers. And they are very much the eyes and ears on the ground, but they also have a communication system in place where they have response teams. And these response teams, they have a training, police reservist training. They're able to carry weapons, but they are community members, so they already have a strong relation with the communities, but they also have the capacity and the ability to do more than just being eyes and ears on the ground. Again, it also has to do with resources. It's not it's costly, and you have to have a strong backup system in place. But I think there are examples where community-trained rangers and scouts can be more than just eyes and ears, but not I would say not in all places. So then I would just emphasize that it's also really important if you're engaging communities that you have a good communication system in place so that you can ensure that people are anonymous who want to maybe report on a crime, but they also know who they're reporting to, how they report, and again, that they have a backup system in place so that they're not jeopardizing themselves in any way. Because we know that, you know, many of these poachers are very well equipped and extremely dangerous. So you don't want to be putting them in that kind of situation if they don't have the capacity to deal with it. So those are just some of my brief comments, but I think there's a lot of great takeaways from this presentation that really apply as well to the work that we're doing on the ground.
Thank you, Mikala. I'm so glad that you brought up the issue about how communities differ and how important it is for us to really understand the complex social dynamics on the ground in the places that we work, and also your example of the police using the dog to also find a child is really relevant to the first question I was going to ask both you and David, with just some more practical examples about how these community engagement projects that we work with can deal with the lack of trust in law enforcement, because I think we all have really good examples of how we have seen law enforcement work in not positive ways, but just to think about other ways that we can help the communities build that trust that is so needed. And I'll throw that out there both to Mikala and David.
Mikala, do you want to take that first?
Sorry, well then I might have to get Megan just to repeat that because I don't think I quite caught it.
More examples of how you can help communities build trust in law enforcement.
Yeah, so one thing I was thinking is that, you know, which has been really important is I think communities need to feel that rangers and scouts and government law enforcement officers, that they're there for their welfare as well. It's not just about the wildlife. And I think, you know, in addressing some of these issues around security, human-wildlife conflict, livelihoods, and the example I gave around the missing child, it really reinforces for them that these people are there also for their own protection and for their own benefits. And I think it's, again, such a vital piece of bringing trusting and strong relationships between, you know, the authorities and communities. So I don't know if that answers or helps.
Mm-hmm.
No, and Megan, I think it's good to also just emphasize that there are great examples of where communities are actively seeking the support and benefiting from the support of protected area authorities. So in DR Congo and around the Okapi Wildlife Reserve, it's really interesting to hear from communities who actually like to be living near ICCN patrol posts, because ICCN in a region of enormous civil strife produces a level of security that's not there, and seems to be a more trusted national authority than the gendarme or the military. And having them in your neighborhood is actually a good thing. I think getting some more of that language out and those stories out is actually useful for governments and conservation organizations.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, we also have great examples of that up in northern Kenya. I mean, that really has been, like I mentioned earlier as well, the motivating factor is the security. And you know, people are so appreciative of the rangers who are in the area, because they know they're there to help also with you know, any kind of tribal conflict that might be happening in that area, and they can respond to it as well. So
I have another question it's kind of related to that having the trust in the law enforcement. But one of the comments that you made early on, David, was about if the resource is valued or not valued by the community. And there's a lot there that we can unpack, but because I'm obviously very biased about my own role that I think pride plays in people's connections to resources. Like Mikala, you talked about in your programs, people value that security, but do they really connect the reason why they have that security to the biodiversity resource? And how have you seen people's that value proposition change so that they see the wildlife resource as that non-economic benefit? Do they really connect it with a kind of a pride in their cultural heritage or their traditions, or just how have you seen different ways to increase the value and especially the non-economic values? And that's a question for both of you.
One thing that I think is really distinctive is that the speed with which communities can understand the value of their direct engagement in enforcing regulations happens so fast in coastal reef systems. In Madagascar, it was less than a year between the time that the locally managed marine areas enforced no-take areas for octopus, then the octopus population significantly rebounded and fishers were reporting increased income. That feedback mechanism is so much slower on land, and particularly in forested areas, because productivity is so much lower. So I think the realization that the speed that a resource recovers and that managers can understand, can see tangibly the impact of their management is so fast in marine systems and so relatively so in terrestrial systems that, as Mikala said, we actually need other ways to reinforce the sort of feedback for good management simply than looking at sort of the economic benefits from direct use.
Yeah, and if I can just add, so it's, you know, it's kind of like, for me, I feel like you have to have like an entry point into working with communities and working on conservation issues. So, you know, you need to understand, you know, what are those key priorities, and how is it you get started working with those communities. And of course, you need to continue to talk about and show the linkage with conservation, but you also will have to, you can't only work on security issues, for example. You know, economic benefits are still needed, livelihood benefits are still needed. So it's about, for me, I think, you know, where you see success with community conservation engagement is where you're really starting slowly and understanding the communities you're working with, and building on those priorities, but knowing that you have to expand so that there's more tangible conservation benefits reaching the communities, which is really not easy. I mean, I think that's one of the areas that we struggle a bit with, and we have some examples from, you know, some key projects, you know, globally, but it's really hard to reach household benefits through conservation livelihoods or, you know, eco-friendly enterprises. You know, you have tourism, which can bring in a lot of money, but actually reaching the majority of the households through tourism is really challenging. So I think it's a process that gets evolved, but, you know, you constantly need to be still bringing in the awareness and the understanding around, you know, conservation, the benefits of conservation.
No, totally agree there, Mikala. I just wanted to let people know that we are taking questions in the chat box if you want to type them in. We have one question from Colin about, could you share any success stories of community engagement and where the local police or the forest or marine authorities are engaged in the illegal activities? I think we can all think of several countries where that might be the case, where the communities don't have that trust in law enforcement because the law enforcement is part of the poaching ring. What would you do? What is that entry point, like Mikala talked about, when you're dealing with corrupt law enforcement?
To me, the only example I've got is where at least one of the arresting authorities is not so corrupt. So, and that's the example that I gave in Okapi Wildlife Reserve, where ICCN is more respected and perceived as more legitimate than, say, the gendarmes or the military. But to be honest, Colin, if your only resort is to an arresting authority that's corrupt and engaged in the poaching that you see on the land that you have claims over, I think then community engagement is extraordinarily difficult.
Yeah, and I think one way they've tried to tackle, or one way, we are trying to tackle it is, you're trying to develop these networks of, networks for communication, for sharing information within the communities and with trusted authorities. So I think, that's part of it as well, is really being able to identify who can be trusted and whether you can build then that kind of communications, relationships, networks to those authorities who are trusted. But I think it's, one of the things I was thinking about too is, often you might have like a very influential person living in your community or coming from your community. And so again, it's really challenging to maybe engage with those communities because they might feel very loyal to this person who, if this influential person is involved in illicit activity, it's, how do you get that community buy-in? So I've just, we've seen examples where in some of the areas where it's been a bit problematic, where they do try to develop these kind of trusted networks. And again, so who you communicate to, and that it's someone that you can trust, and you'll still remain anonymous.
Yeah, I think this is a great example of how so much of our work that we're doing in wildlife trafficking really is part of those integrated programming, and the solutions that we need to draw on for wildlife go back to the democracy and resource governance issues, and in this case, fighting corruption through trying to make things more transparent, and the management of resources more transparent. A little bit earlier, we had a comment and question from Michael Painter around the importance of the devolution of rights to resources, and I thought maybe both David and Mikala could comment a little bit about how that has worked, especially in the context of Kenya, where there's been such decentralization processes going on, how rights have played into community valuing their wildlife resources. David, Mikala?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Kenya, sorry, go ahead, David.
No, Mikala, I was actually saying you go ahead.
Oh, okay. So yeah, it is a very decentralized government here in Kenya. I think, again, you still, although you do we have counties who are actually, some of them are quite supportive of the community conservancies and the work that they're doing. And although you also have strong legislation in place that's really supporting community rights over resources, I think there's still a lot of challenges though. And so it's of course so important that you are, that communities do have these rights, and that they feel they have these rights, but there also needs to still be support coming from the government, resources from the government that's really supporting for this to fully evolve and to be helping these communities, because they can't be dealing with conservation on their own. They, have very limited resources, and so in order to be supporting the legislation and to be supporting devolution, you also need to be putting the resources towards it. So I think, it's starting to change, but I think there's still, I think in Kenya you still have some work where you need to still be getting more buy-in from government.
Yeah, and I would say from from the Wildlife Conservation Society perspective, over time we've realized that securing rights is a challenge, but nothing like as challenging as helping the communities build the governance structures they need to enforce their rights. So in many communities that we work in, the families made decisions about natural resources, not the community. And so once the community secured rights, there has to be this whole new political system that's put in place that helps the community to make communal decisions about communally owned resources. For most communities, that's their first experience with the sort of democratic rule. And that takes a long, long time. And I think we've got to be honest about the kind of support that communities need to enforce their legitimate rights by building these transparent, accountable governance systems.
No, it's totally totally true what you said about kind of how do you define the community? Is it that one individual and or even at the family level, as you mentioned? I'm going to give David and Mikala an opportunity for kind of final last words. Is there any point that you wanted to make that you haven't made so far?
I would just like to say that I think there's enormous value in engaging communities in the sustainable management of natural resources, and anti-poaching and anti-trafficking is one of those elements. But unless we can help communities develop the systems they need to govern their resources, and they get the timely assistance of a competent arresting authority, I think we could be putting communities, particularly with high value poaching, into severe jeopardy. And we should try and avoid that.
Yeah, so I would echo David's comments because I think they were very good and I agree fully. And then just, I guess one thing, just having this webinar, I mean, I think there's still so much for us to learn, and there's a lot of good things happening out there, a lot of good examples. And I think it's really when we're able to share those concrete examples, we can start thinking about how we can really apply it in our work. So I would just also say that I welcome more webinars like this where we can share examples of the work that we're actually doing in our relative countries. So.
And just so everyone on the phone knows, this is the first time I've ever talked to Mikala. So we didn't collude, and we didn't actually decide to agree on all these topics. So that was.
That is true, and I did not pay Mikala to say that. So as you go forward to the next slide, perhaps, I just wanted to make another pitch to the people on this phone call, and actually just say thank you for sharing and disseminating this within your country programs. That we have launched a case study compilation effort. So going back to those 3 take-home messages that David talked about in terms of making sure that communities have the benefits and they value their resources, that there's social cohesion. We know that those are all kind of enabling conditions and key factors that we need to get communities to really feel empowered and protect their wildlife resources. But as we talked a lot about here, building that trust and confidence of working with law enforcement, we wanted to try to also instead of disseminating and learning from each other, just also generate new knowledge and what are successful examples of communities working with law enforcement. And so we launched this case study compilation effort. I've heard from Vietnam to Mozambique to Madagascar that this case study, call for case studies, has gotten out there. We'll be collecting the case studies online until July 21st. Early in July, I will send out another kind of prompt and reminder to people, and I would really appreciate it if you could share that widely within your networks. At this point of time, Sean Peabody from Measure Impact is going to just show us a little bit about the websites that we have for the learning group, just to help orient folks. So Sean, can you take us through it? Sean,
I'm here.
Okay,
I'm here. Yes, thanks so much, Megan. So this is just a quick reminder to everyone that we have a website set up for this learning group. And you can see the address up there at the top, and we'll put it in the chat in a second. And here's the homepage. You may have tried this previously and had a login wall. We've now removed that, so you can come here and you can jump right in. And two things I want to highlight on this website. One is the learning agenda page, which you can get to from that top nav bar. And if you scroll down a little bit on this page, you can see a little bit about the 3 strategic approaches that we're focused on for this learning group and our theory of change here. And then down below, we've got the learning questions and then sort of the longer-term plan for this collaborative learning group with the activities and products that we're hoping to develop, and then what we hope to do with those products in the far right. Then the last thing I want to highlight now are the documents. We've got a big library of resources available related to this learning group. You can see some of the featured resources right there. And below that, we've got this table of contents we've built around the learning questions. So you can click on any of those learning questions, and it'll take you to documents that are related to them. So it should be pretty easy to find things that are of interest. And you can go back, actually. And down below this, a little bit more, you can, if you're looking specifically, you want to see our webinars or case studies or some of the toolkits or other things, or if you're interested in a particular geography or a particular audience like investigators or judges, then you can navigate to resources there. And then the last thing I'll highlight is just maybe click on the webinars there. Is we've got several webinar recordings that we've done already. This is number maybe 4 or 5, I can't remember. So if you've missed any of those, I would really encourage you to go back and take a look and check those out. So I think I'll end there and give it back to Megan.
Great. Well, speaking of webinars, I did want to put a plug in for our next webinar, which is scheduled now for July 20th. We'll be focusing on the learning questions around demand reduction, and specifically we'll talk with Gail Burgess from Traffic, who will share her opinion with us about what good demand reduction looks like, and she'll also show a little bit about the demand reduction toolkit website that Traffic has created with USAID and other donor support. So without further ado, I would just want to extend my heartfelt thank you to David and Mikala for sharing with us today, and also for this community for all the questions that you've shared with us. As always, if you have any suggestions for webinar topics or ideas that you'd like to share with us, what you think would be most beneficial, please just send me an email at mhill@usaid.gov. I'm happy to do whatever I can. I'm particularly looking for people who would like to serve as kind of commenters or share their experience, kind of like what Mikala did today. Mikala's been very busy with travel and being sick, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us how this is applied in your context, Mikala. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
My pleasure. Bye.
Thank you, David.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
David.